Thank you very much, everyone, and sorry I entered the conversation with some delay, thank you for inviting me. Today we are going to present somehow a project we are involved in and the challenges and somehow the developments, the work we are doing and we have done so far in order to produce some results based on this project. Actually, the project I'm talking about is EDMO, so maybe Konrad, you can go to the second slide already. As the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom we are working in is involved now also in this project that is the European Digital Media Observatory that is led by the European University Institute with the cooperation of other universities, fact checkers and online companies in order to develop somehow some research and some kind of actions that are needed in order to the project says put together all the relevant stakeholders that are dealing, in this case, with the disinformation phenomenon. We are focusing on disinformation, and to create somehow a platform for discussion at European level involving all the relevant stakeholders in this discussion, and in order also to create the conditions to also develop some measures to fight disinformation to some extent. So within this project, as the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom at the UI, we are asked to deal with the policy research and analysis. And in order to do so, we do some analysis in order to define the trends when it comes to the disinformation phenomenon, mostly from a policy perspective, report to the European Commission on the trends on the disinformation phenomenon. We try to cooperate with other European observatories in order to share best practices and information on disinformation. But I mean, what we are talking, we want to talk you about today is this task that we have, because we have to find a methodology to assess the code of practice on disinformation. We have to suggest to research on this methodology to assess the code of practice. Can you go to the next slide, please? So what is the code of practice on disinformation? It's a self-regulatory instrument signed by the representatives of online platforms, leading social networks, advertisers, advertising industry, that committed to put in place actions to limit the spread of disinformation, harmful content, and to do this within the current legal framework, including the directive on e-commerce and the rules on liability of intermediaries therein. The commitments are built, the commitments of the platforms, since here we are talking about disinformation online mostly, most of the attention is devoted to the behavior of online platforms, but the code is structured in 5 pillars. The scrutiny of ad placement that aims to demonetize purveyors of disinformation, political and issue-based advertising in order to foster the transparency of political and issue-based advertising, integrity of services, limit inauthentic behaviors online, empowering consumers, and within the actions to empower consumers, there is also the findability of, improving the findability of trustworthy content, and empowering the research community, for instance, with access to data for fact checkers academy, access to data of the platforms, in order to allow research and better fact checking. And recently, the European Commission issued a new guidance in order to in order to guide the platforms for a new code that will be issued probably in October 2021, and that is also expanding somehow the scope of potentially expanding the scope of the code itself to misinformation, and would like to open to other signatories, including messaging apps. But what has been done so far? I mean, what was the life of this code of practice on disinformation? Maybe you can go to the next slide. The code has been drafted and signed in 2018, but since then, even there has been an improvement also with the experience on the reporting on the, let's say, infodemic on COVID-19. It has been hard to appreciate the effectiveness of its implementation, how the platforms performed in putting in place, in trying to comply with the commitments that we mentioned before. Because there is no standard for its evaluation, no clear standard for its evaluation, for reporting. There is lack of oversight on the compliance, lack of sanctions for non-compliance, and lack of data against which to check the statements and the reports by the platforms themselves. So this is a self-regulatory instrument and relies a lot on the self-reporting of the platforms with no specific oversight. So what is our task within this project is to try to find a methodology to assess the impact of the code on disinformation, on the disinformation phenomenon. And in order to do so, and probably you can go to the next slide, the methodology should be based on one hand on the so-called key performance indicators. They are mentioned in the code, in the reports of ERGA and of the Commission. The key performance indicators are the benchmarks against which to assess how the platforms and the signatories in general complied with the specific commitments of the code. So we call them also service level objectives, service level indicators that are linked exactly to the objectives of the code of practice. So on one hand, our methodology will be based on this, but and this is where we are focusing mostly our research, we want to create a methodology. We want to conceive a methodology that focuses mostly on structural indicator that should allow the assessment of how the behavior of the signatories impacted the information system as a whole. So we aim to define a methodology that is based on a normative approach that takes into account the principles, how, let's say, democracy, freedom of expression, elections were impacted by the code itself, and also taking into account economic and socio-political aspects. So, and you can please, Konrad, go to the next slide. What we are aiming to is a normative perspective, so macro level indicators to be listed in order to define benchmarks against which we have to assess the code commitments in order to see how they effectively impacted information pluralism, and also to see whether the implementation of the code complied overall with the rule of law, for instance, and its assessment takes into account the specificities of the countries, the specificities of the national context where the code was somehow implemented. In order to do so, we are thinking of a methodology that is based on legal, economic, political, social indicators, both quantitative and qualitative, and that hopefully will benefit of the network that this EDMO project is creating in order to collect data and information, hopefully also by the platform themselves. I think that now I pass the floor to Konrad for some more detailed examples. Thank you.
Thank you. So Elda already mentioned what the requirements for these indicators are, so I'm not going to repeat it, but if you want to know more, we have organized 2 panels on the topic on the so-called EDMO week, which took place last week. I will share the YouTube links with those who are interested here in the chat later. Just briefly, we have key performance indicators that evaluate what the signatories have been doing under the 5 pillars. Here, the Commission has a relatively clear understanding of what it is looking for, and this is also mentioned in the current guidelines. I would only add that we envision these indicators as a set of questions posed to the signatories that they have to answer themselves, and we want that these questions have to be phrased in a way that they give very limited, or rather no, opportunity for the platforms to misinterpret them, because this has been a problem in the past reports. And we also advocate for an independent audit of these answers. So here we have some examples, and I hope that the slide is not too packed with information, but since the session is recorded, everyone will have the time to revisit them afterwards. So first we have the quantitative KPIs. They look at the existence of definitions, as the code specifically asks signatories to come up with a working definition on issue-based advertising. Then it asks platforms to list the measures taken and asks them to explain how their measures are consistent with the rule of law. And again, this is just a sample. These are not all the KPIs that we will ask. The next slide is looking at the quantitative KPIs. So here we ask them for numbers. numbers that are as exact as possible on the amount of political and issue-based advertising on their platforms, their share in revenues, and as much data as possible on mislabeled, non-labeled, or reported accounts, as well as users' interaction with them. And I'm not sure if I mentioned, but anyway, I will just repeat it then. These questions, the ones that we mentioned until now, they will be asked to the platforms themselves. And then they will be audited by another set of stakeholders. Then the second set of indicators are the structural indicators. They look at the impact of platforms' actions on the news diet of users. This is where the Commission has less of an idea so far. And as Elda mentioned, the guidelines aim to introduce a representative sample of online users to see what sources of information they use and to what extent they are exposed to purveyors of disinformation. In addition, we would also want to use the insights coming from civil society, academia, fact checkers, and other stakeholders. They would provide us with an assessment of regulation or an assessment of the situation on the ground. Here's again a sample of the indicators we provide for the same pillar as before. Those who are familiar with our other project, the Media Pluralism Monitor, can also see that these indicators are partly influenced by the questionnaire of the MPM, as we hope to feed our experience from the MPM into EDMO and vice versa. So here you can see we look at the legal environment. We ask for an assessment of the actual practice of political advertisement, but also about their consistency with the rule of law. And then, of course, these indicators need to have a time frame so that we can track progress from one reporting period to the other. Based on the current guidelines of the Commission, this period will be 6 months for large platforms and 1 year for smaller ones. And then the KPIs will feed into the structural indicators. Without that, it would be impossible to establish the link between the code and the overall developments. Or hopefully we can talk about improvements, not just developments related to disinformation. And of course, it is important to go a step further, conduct an analytic analysis of pluralism, collect further data on audiences, and so on. And this is also reflected in the code itself, where Pillar 5 is about empowering the research community. I'm not sure how much time we have. I think we used most of the time that is available to us. So I would probably not go that much into trustworthiness. I will just quickly mention it because this is partly what we write about in our chapter. The code asks for these indicators of trustworthiness. But in order to understand what they are, first we have to look at what is meant by being trustworthy, or what is meant by trustworthiness. Based on the key documents, we can say that it is a key characteristic of the source of publishers, or of the source of information, or the publisher of a piece of information. It means that there is a low chance for users to be exposed to false or misleading content if they consume this source of information. And these trustworthy sources, which are often news media, have a procedure in place to make sufficient and timely corrections. There is an emphasis on transparency and ownership, authorship, and sourcing of information, meaning that we have to know who produces it and how the information came to existence. And finally, they have procedures in place to clearly label advertisement and paid content, as well as separating fact from opinion. We look at 4 prominent projects: the Trust Project, the Credibility Coalition, the Journalism Trust Initiative, the NewsGuard browser extension, and yeah, that's 4. Some of their characteristics are that they all work in cooperation with platforms. Some of them are funded by Google or Facebook, but there's also one which is partly or co-funded by the European Commission. That's the Journalism Trust Initiative. They connect trustworthiness to content creators or content sources, and they focus predominantly on news media. Their insights should be used to inform the algorithms of online platforms and thereby provide extra prominence to those content sources that are most trustworthy. The guidelines of the Commission for the Code 2.0 say that these should be optional features of the platforms. So the users themselves could decide whether they want to use this trustworthiness filter or not. And since there is more than one source of trustworthiness indicators, there's also a discussion about having a competitive environment of indicators where the users can choose not just whether or not they want to use these filters, but also pick which one they prefer. So far, it is not clear how platforms aim to make use of these indicators. So we looked at the indicators of these projects, and some of the key indicators that they identified were the following: past conduct of publishers, which is basically whether or not they have shared this information in the past or misinformation; the sourcing of articles, so whether there is a diversity and of viewpoints, a transparency of sources, whether they interact with readers, whether the arguments they make are logically sound. There is the issue of correction and labeling, which on the one hand means that there have to be timely corrections if they make mistakes, but there's also a need for labeling of advertisements. So if something is advertising, on their site, it has to be correctly labeled like that. And there is the transparency of owners, funders, and content creators. We found that the current indicators are suitable for ex-ante measures, but they allow only for narrow application and might have unintended side effects. There were three key problems that we identified. They provided a competitive advantage to established players. There was an issue with compliance, as some of the indicators required auditing, which cannot be made mandatory. And there was an issue with the respect for privacy and the right to anonymity, which might conflict with some of these indicators that are listed here. And finally, and this is our last slide, we made some proposals ourselves related to this issue. We recommended that the indicators apply to large established content creators. There should be no punishment for non-compliance or non-cooperation with indicator provided, but instead there should be a reward for upgrading or for compliance. So there should be a reward which is upgrading. We asked that fact checkers monitor both compliant and non-compliant outlets, and if there are repeated violations, that has to lead to downgrading. And finally, small content producers or newly established outlets or even blogs should be able to use the organic services, so the non-paid services of platforms, without constraints, as long as they are not found violating these rules.